It's a rainy September morning in Athens, and some 350 athletes from all over the world are gathering under the Acropolis to reenact the most high-stakes run in history. For the next 36 hours, they will attempt to run from the heart of Athens across some of Greece's most treacherous terrain to Sparta, 6 marathons away. It would seem beyond the limits of human endurance. But 2,500 years ago, facing annihilation by the Persian Empire, Athens sent a single runner on the same desperate race to plead for Sparta's help. His name was Phidippides. He seemed their only hope.
Phidippides knew the Persians would wipe Athens from the map. He knew democracy would be completely obliterated.
Democracy then was merely 17 years old, and it was about to set off a chain reaction of art, drama, philosophy, and science that would have been unthinkable anywhere else.
It is a world of almost constant innovation. They never sit and just rest on their laurels.
They were working out the best way to be a human, the best way to live in the world. And that's an idea that is as strong now as when it was first conceived 25 centuries ago.
In the crucible under the Acropolis, the modern mind had been unleashed. The Greeks. The 152-mile Spartathlon, from Athens to Sparta, honors a pivotal moment in Greece's quest for greatness. When the earliest sparks of Western civilization were nearly stamped out. It was 490 BC, and Greece wasn't anything like the nation we think of today. It was a network of some 1,500 often warring city-states, each with vastly different sizes, strengths, and forms of government. Athens, the largest city-state, was unique among them. It had undergone a major political revolution less than 2 decades earlier, where ordinary people rejected tyranny and instituted a radical new form of government. Democracy. For the first time in history, power was truly in the hands of the people. They could serve in government and vote on everything from tax rates to declarations of war.
Democracy is really fetishized and cherished. It comes to be worshipped as a goddess. There's a fantastic stone stele in Athens of democracy as a goddess crowning Ho Demos, the common people.
It was the beginning of the ancient Greece we think we know. That 170-year-long golden age, whose legacy is invoked everywhere, from the streets of modern Athens to the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. But democracy almost died in its teens.
So Athens had become a democracy in 507 BC. But just 17 years later, she faced the greatest challenge she'd ever faced, the Persian Empire.
The Persians had amassed the world's first global empire under powerful King Darius, conquering south to Egypt, east to India, and west to Turkey. Now, they had their sights set on Europe, and only little Athens and its vastly outnumbered army here on the shores of Marathon stood in their way. That's where Pheidippides' storied run comes in.
Pheidippides was what they call an all-day runner. And that was a strategic advantage the Greeks had to communicate. I mean, it was like the internet, 2,500 years ago, and they did it on foot.
Modern marathons are based on the legend that Pheidippides ran about 26 miles from Marathon to Athens. Naked, of course, to alert leaders of the battle's outcome, and promptly dropped dead from exhaustion. It's a tale immortalized in poetry and paintings. But it turns out that our marathons may only represent the last piddling 26 of a much longer run.
Greeks would have laughed their heads off at this idiotic story. 26 miles, that's nothing.
The historian Herodotus tells us that before the Battle of Marathon even began, Pheidippides had to run 150 miles to Sparta and back to plead for support from the warrior Spartans. Today's Spartathletes are trying to complete that first leg. Some take it more seriously than others. Ultramarathoner Dean Karnassus is trying to manage it on only the foods Pheidippides would have eaten.
It's basically a ground sesame paste, figs, cured meat, nuts.
He feels this run in his blood.
I'm 100% Greek, and my dad always insists we're from this, the same region as Pheidippides.
Can you imagine Pheidippides out here by himself, running to save democracy?
Without roads, over mountains, and through the dark of night, Pheidippides is said to have reached Sparta in just 36 hours, only to face one of history's cruelest rejections. In the midst of a sacred festival, the Spartans wouldn't fight until the full moon.
They said, we'll come help you, but it's just going to be 3 or 4 days.
And so Pheidippides made the 176-mile return trip back to the battlefield at Marathon to alert the generals that the Spartans would be delayed. The Athenians would face down the world's first true superpower without them, outnumbered by more than 2 to 1.
This is a critical moment to push back against the Persians. No one's done it successfully before.
But there'd never been an army like this before. The 10,000 Athenians were now free and equal men. Bound by a communal sense of brotherhood, they weren't about to surrender their hard-won rights over to an autocratic ruler. The Greeks stood shield over shield in a 4-day standoff against the Persians, until finally, in what seemed a desperate move, they charged the much larger army. When the Athenian center seemed to falter, the Persians pushed forward, only to find themselves surrounded by the Greeks' stronger flanks. It was a rout. The Persians lost 6,400 soldiers, according to Herodotus. The Greeks, only 192. Democracy was safe, for the moment. The Battle of Marathon left the young democracy feeling invincible. And it soon found itself wealthy as well, striking a rich vein of silver in a mine near Cape Sunion, later home to the Temple of Poseidon. It was worth about $60 million in today's money. And Athenians were eager for their share of the spoils. But one general, Themistocles, knew full well that the Persians would be back, and he wanted that silver to mount a defense. Democracy being what it is, he first had to convince the citizens of Athens to part with it. A political reality no tyrant ever had to deal with.
Folks were deciding what to do with that silver, and he played upon their sense of pride, their sense of security, their sense, above all, of potential greatness as a city, which Athens had not achieved.
Themistocles convinced them to use this silver to build a huge navy.
Here, at Athens' port of Piraeus, archaeologist Bjorn Levin and his team are excavating the immense harbor that Themistocles built for his dream navy. By sifting through the murk of almost 2,500 years, they're starting to uncover the actual structures that housed and launched Themistocles' fleet.
So it was a massive structures. Imagine the whole shoreline lined with ship sheds.
The ship sheds would form one of the largest structures in the ancient world, housing 200 of the greatest fighting galleys of the day. Triremes, battleship, speedboat, and torpedo all in one. Themistocles, though, didn't pitch triremes as just weapons of war, but as engines of democracy, giving lower-class citizens a chance to rise through Athens' political ranks.
You get power as citizens by fighting for your city.
Each trireme required 200 crew members, so for 200 ships,
you would need close to 40,000 men.
Ultimately, every post in the land of Athens was open to the poorest citizen because of the navy.
In 480 BC, just 10 years after Marathon, Themistocles' worst fears came true. The Persians struck first here, at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where for days more than 100,000 besieged an allied Greek force of only 7,000. But this time, it would be Sparta's finest hour. Under their king Leonidas, 300 Spartans famously fought to the death, holding back the Persians long enough for their Greek allies to escape. But the pass eventually fell, and the Persians poured into the Greek peninsula, bent on revenge against Athens. Themistocles had to do something drastic. In an urgent order, he called for the complete evacuation of women, children, and the elderly from the city. All men to the triremes of his new navy. Athens itself would be left to the mercy of the Persians, who'd burn it to the ground. Themistocles would now take the battle to sea, to the nearby straits of Salamis.
The Athenians brought 200 warships to the Battle of Salamis, and the Allies brought around 200, so around 80,000 people at sea on that morning.
And that's just the Greek allies. The Persian fleet was twice as big. Luring the Persians into Salamis' narrow straits, Themistocles sprung a trap. His triremes ran circles around the hulking Persian ships, torpedoing them with their rams and sending nearly half of them to the bottom. It was the first major naval victory in recorded history.
The Battle of Salamis is a turning point in Western civilization. The young men that were sitting at the oars, they had fought together against incredible odds, and they had won.
Men of free will had pulled together to defeat the superpower of the day. Democracy, it seemed, was no flash in the pan, but a force to be reckoned with. Free from tyrannical rulers and imperial threats, Athenians were now free to build a new society. An ideal state that actively sought perfection in all things, from government and architecture to philosophy and art. The great golden age of Athens had dawned. And under the rule of a powerful new statesman named Pericles, it would trumpet its arrival from the unoccupied heights above the city.
Pericles decides that he is going to make a lasting memorial to Athens' greatness for all time. So he commissions the best architects, the best sculptors, the best artists, and he designs the building plan of the Acropolis.
$100,000 tons of the finest marble, hundreds of breathtaking sculptures that seemed to breathe life into stone, and a fantastic 4-story statue of Athena, decorated in gold and ivory, as expensive as the building itself. The Parthenon still stands as democracy's light on a hill, a proud symbol of Greek and human achievement. The real business of humans during the Golden Age didn't take place up on the Acropolis, but far below.
So this area behind me is the Agora. It's basically in antiquity a great big open square where you can get all the people together for a variety of functions. You could come down here one day and it would be set up for an election. You could come down the next day, be set up as a marketplace. Next day there'd be athletic contests.
John Camp has led the excavations here for 2 decades.
We're standing basically ground zero for democracy. This is where the concept was first invented and where it was practiced for 150 years.
Democracy, whether we like it or not, requires bureaucracy. And the foundations of the Agora buildings show that's as it's always been. There was a Senate, a mint, courts of law. Buildings you might find in capitals today. But this newborn democracy would barely be familiar to us now. For starters, Athenians didn't elect most of their leaders. Elections could be bought and rigged. So they selected most officials jury duty style.
They would pull 500 names out of a hat, and those guys would serve for 1 year. They would meet every day except festival days, and they would consider legislation.
Participation wasn't simply voluntary either. It was a sacred duty. Once in office, the leaders couldn't vote on new laws. They could only propose them. Passing them came down to ordinary citizens who voted by a show of hands.
Every Athenian voted on whether they were going to raise taxes or whether they were going to build the Parthenon. Every Athenian male voted. They didn't delegate it to a group of representatives. If you had a time machine and if an Athenian dropped into the US, an Athenian would say, well, you're not a democracy. You know, you yourself didn't vote on the latest tax increase or Obamacare or anything like that. That was decided for you.
Athenians knew power corrupted and came up with their own way to deal with it. All along the roads of the Agora, archaeologists have found discarded shards of pottery called ostraca. Once a year, citizens could carve the names of dubious politicians onto the clay fragments and cast them into a jar. If enough votes were tallied, the official was ostracized, banned from the city for 10 years.
Pretty much every prominent Athenian of the first half of the 5th century BC took one of these 10-year vacations, courtesy of the Athenian people.
It all sounds nice, in theory. But in practice, Athenian democracy was also profoundly limited. Fewer than 20% of the population could vote.
Women didn't count. There were lots of people who came from other Greek cities and lived here, but they weren't citizens. And there were plenty of slaves. So yes, in that sense, it's not a very democratic society.
One thing Athenians were very good at was networking. And the Agora was the place to be. Here, riffraff rubbed shoulders with the greatest minds to grace the earth.
You can imagine, and it's true that they were here, Pericles, Sophocles, Thucydides, all these great Athenians, spending time in the square and in the public buildings around the square.
And at the center of them all, a hypnotic figure whose radical new way of thinking could only have taken root in this free society. The father of Western philosophy, Socrates.
This is Explorer. Rodrigo Duterte's drug war has accounted for 5,900 deaths and counting.
Internet, it has become a weapon of mass destruction.
We have to live together.
Explorer, η ολοκαίνουργια σειρά, αύριο στις 11 παρά 20 το βράδυ, στο National Geographic.
Actor and producer Yannis Simonides has played the inquisitive Socrates in performances around the globe.
He says, the unexamined life is not worth living. If you do not explore it, if you do not examine it, you might as well go die.
Socrates' notorious line of questioning, though, was also relentless. And in the Agora, he became a professional thorn in the side of almost everyone.
Just a pain in the ass. He's just bothering everybody by just not shutting up and questioning people and harassing them. As he calls himself, a gadfly.
Like a gadfly stinging a sleepy horse awake, Socrates confronted politicians and poets, craftsmen and kids, questioning them ad nauseum about their views on everything from democracy and tyranny to love, war, and death. It would be called the Socratic method, a question and answer dialogue which challenged all assumptions, always in search of a deeper truth. But philosophy was not the only path to truth. Within just a few generations of the Persian defeat, as culture flowered all over the city, the Greek love of storytelling, hearkening all the way back to the epics of Homer, exploded into a wildly popular new art form. With the introduction of actors, a chorus, a narrator, and perhaps most importantly, a theater. The Greeks invented comedy, tragedy, and all of Western drama, confronting themes we grapple with to this day.
It was Civics 101 to listen to tragedy and to try to become more moral by processing the most important questions of life. The experience of dying in war, falling in love, being aware of forces around you that are beyond the human realm. How do we explain them? And if we can't explain them, what do we call them then?
So tragedy gives you serious philosophical problems. Comedy is there to actually put your politicians on trial by laughter.
As it does today, comedy offered people a platform to poke fun at their fellow citizens and to criticize those in power. Even that celebrated visionary behind the Parthenon.
Pericles himself had caricatures of him in the comic theatre. He always wore his helmet in public. We don't really know why. So he often had an onion on his head. But he got elected year after year. He survived trial by democratic comedy.
By 431 BC, Athens had become the center of a cultural empire. Euripides and Sophocles were competing for best playwright. And the Parthenon had just opened to the public. Its marble frieze, a third of which survives in the nearby Acropolis Museum, depicts the annual festival of Athena's birthday. But the real focus of the sculptures isn't gods, but people, and the perfection of the human form.
Greeks thought that human beings are in the center of the world. They were thinking that the protagonists were themselves.
Man was the measure of all things. To quote the Greek philosopher Protagoras, humans, not gods, were behind Athens' extraordinary rise. Of course, with every great rise comes an equally fantastical fall. And in the din of self-congratulation, Athenians had grown tone-deaf to the cautionary myths that had guided their ancestors for hundreds of years.
One of the most famous and favourite myths for the Greeks was the story of Daedalus and Icarus. So the inventor Daedalus and Icarus, his son.
Daedalus built wings made of wood and wax for his son Icarus, allowing him to take to the skies. But he also issued a warning. Fly too low, and the moist sea air would dampen the wings. Fly too high, and the sun would melt them. We all know what happens next.
Icarus flies up to the sun, and the wax in the wings melt, and Icarus plunges down to earth.
Icarus, tempted to see the world as the gods did, became the ultimate symbol of hubris, Greek for excessive pride, and paid the ultimate price for it.
And the Greeks told one another this story because they were saying, go for it, make your mark in the world, but also remember that as a species we have limits.
If Athens had forgotten the lessons of hubris, the rest of the Greeks had not. The richest city in the Greek world had built the ultimate temple to itself on the backs of others by extorting exorbitant taxes. Protection money, really, from hundreds of neighboring cities. And all this time, Athens was flourishing. That other great ancient city-state, Sparta, had been watching with growing resentment. Spartans venerated athletic and military might over cultural perfection. By age 7, boys were taken from their mothers and raised as soldiers. They ran without shoes to harden their feet. They were beaten and deprived of food to harden their bodies and hearts. They would have approved of the Spartathlon.
Good luck.
100 miles into the 150-mile race, Dean Karnassus is struggling on with his self-imposed 5th century BC diet. And others aren't faring much better. The ones who forge on will now face their most punishing challenge yet. Mount Parthenia, a 4,000-foot climb through the dead of night. It's their last big hurdle before Sparta, a mere 2 marathons away, where by 432 BC, hardened Spartans had had enough of arrogant Athens and declared war. The bloody Peloponnesian War would embroil the Greek city-states for nearly 3 decades. And even the gods seem to have grown weary of Athens' pride. A plague swept through the city, killing about 1/4 of the Athenian population, including Pericles. And as the war dragged on, Athens turned against everything it stood for. In 399 BC, none other than Socrates was put on trial. In the one-man show Socrates Now, Yannis Simonides reenacts Plato's account of Socrates' self-defense before his Athenian jury.
You should be careful!
Socrates' relentless examining and questioning had grown increasingly unwelcome to Athens' leaders during the long war, when order and stability became more valued than new ideas.
Anything but a skillful speaker.
They drummed up charges to silence him.
Socrates is guilty of wrongdoing because he corrupts the young. He doesn't believe in the gods of the city, but rather in new demons. His sentence should be death.
The trial of Socrates is one that continues to this day.
We can look at those that are pushing for women's equality, or for gay equality, or for equitable income. They disturb the system. They make waves. Whether you like them or not, they make us think.
Socrates was given the chance to avoid his death sentence if he'd abandoned his incessant questioning. He famously downed a cup of poisoned hemlock instead. Though his message would span the ages, his death would mark the beginning of the end for Athens' golden age. By the time of Socrates' death, Athens had lost the brutal Peloponnesian War with Sparta. The Athenian Empire was slowly crumbling. And in 338 BC, a mere 170 years after its invention, its democracy finally fell.
The Greek world was upside down. I mean, the democracy was falling apart. I mean, the city-states were fighting each other. But Greece doesn't come to an end when Athens falls. We have something that is new.
That something came in the form of an unlikely force from northern Greece, Macedon, led not by citizens, but a king, Philip II. Taking advantage of the weakened Greek city-states, Philip conquered them all, except for Sparta, and for the first time ever, united them into one kingdom. Archaeologist Angeliki Kotoridi helped excavate Philip's tomb in 1977.
Philip is is a genius. He developed a new system of government by mixing the royalty, the kingdom, and independent city-states.
Inviting the greatest artists, architects, and thinkers from Athens and beyond to his palace here in Aigai, Philip wanted to be the first philosopher king, an enlightened monarch, as described by Plato, Socrates' famous disciple. With Greece conquered, Philip longed to invade Persia and the rest of the known world. But in 336 BC, at a wedding in this very theater, Philip was murdered by his own bodyguard. The task of world domination would instead fall to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Trained by Spartan warriors and steeped in philosophy by Plato's star pupil, Aristotle, Alexander was impatient for greatness. Within 2 years of his father's assassination, he led a force almost 50,000 strong into Asia and brought down Greece's old adversary, the Persian Empire. From there, he marched on to Egypt, declaring himself pharaoh and establishing Greek rule that would last all the way to Cleopatra. Alexander then spent the next decade expanding his empire all the way to India. Along the way, he won hearts and minds, paying respects to local gods, marrying several local women, and forcing his men to do the same, and always spreading the Greek ideals.
Alexander tried really to connect people so that through marriage mixed together they forget the ideas of Greek and barbarians. It was the beginning of a beautiful new era. Different people, different nations, different religions, and they create this common civilization, the Hellenistic civilization.
Unfortunately for Alexander, it was a civilization he'd never get to witness. In 323 BC, carried off by typhoid fever, or perhaps poison, he was dead at just 32. But his short reign would seed Greek language, thought, and culture from the warm islands of the Mediterranean to the sands of Egypt to the foothills of the Himalaya.
Μεγάλο αφιέρωμα του National Geographic κάθε Πέμπτη βράδυ.
Where's the airport?
Τραγωδία στον αέρα. Οι πιο απίστευτες υποθέσεις. Κάθε Πέμπτη από τις 9 το βράδυ. Στο National Geographic.
It's 6 a.m. in modern Sparta. And crossing the finish line of the impossibly long Spartathlon is a child of another great civilization. Running the 152 miles in less than 23 hours, Ivan Kudin of Italy is first to kiss the Spartan king Leonidas' feet. And fittingly, it was Italy's ancient forebears, Rome, who beginning in around the 3rd century BC would pick up the Greek torch.
The Romans admired everything the Greeks did. They didn't like them as, what do we want to say, they thought they were kind of effeminate, they were disorganized, but they recognized that they were creative. And so they stole Greek sculpture, they brought in tutors from Greece for their children. All significant Romans came here. Caesar was here, Pompey was here, Cicero was here, pretty much everybody.
Rome carried the Greek tradition forward for hundreds of years, until in the 4th century AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to an insurgent new religion, Christianity. All things Greek were soon given a new label, pagan. Science became heretical, philosophy dangerous, and any celebration of the Greco-Roman gods blasphemous. After nearly 2 millennia of continual operation, the church shuttered the venerated oracle of Delphi, extinguished the Olympic flame, and all but wiped so-called paganism off the map. It would be another 1,000 years before the secret history of Greece was rediscovered in the West, sparking the Renaissance, reigniting ideas of logic and reasoning, realism in art, and a belief in the human potential to determine one's own fate. It was a way of thinking that inspired a band of Enlightenment revolutionaries who in 1776 launched a new world of their own, with democracy at its very core.
Greece lives on. We are still the intellectual children of Greek thought, of Greek ideas, the idea that everyone has a voice and should be heard. This is something that we're directly in debt to Greece.
To be a Greek is not a matter of blood, but a matter of mind.
After 34 hours, 45 minutes, and 27 seconds, Greek-American Dean Karnassus is finally reaching the end of his own journey.
Georgi Ortyukov.